Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya from Wakelocks.com, and today at LinuxCon we have Chris DiBona, Director of Open Source at Google. So Chris, can you tell us a little bit more about open source at Google?
Sure. So Google started using open source at the very beginning. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but our first web server was actually written in Python, the very open source language. And then if you look at Google today, it's basically a Linux kernel underlying a bunch of the regular system tools you'd expect, and then a bunch of software built using open source libraries, as well as our software that we've written custom, and then built using open source compilers like GCC and LLVM and the rest, both of which we have significant patches into. So open source is part of pretty much everything we ship and everything we do, from the search engine to apps and spreadsheets and docs to the devices like the Android devices that we ship, the Nexus devices, and devices like Google Glass. The self-driving car runs on Linux. I mean, it's pretty much everywhere.
But when we look at Android, it's not a traditional open source project where anyone can contribute to it. Yes, the source code is available, but the contribution model is a bit different.
Yeah, Android is like that a little bit. So what I like to tell people is whatever model of open source development you like, I can point to an example of it at Google because we have so much of it. Usually, like for instance, Chrome looks more like a traditional, quote unquote, open source project, where much of the, like 99% of the development is done externally. And then we do the every 2-week release cycle. So those changes come really fast to the external trees. And it's funny, even with Android, you know, Android is, people talking about Android as like a monolithic project, but if you look at how we develop Android actually, what you find is that at the system level especially, there's oftentimes, at the kernel level and the rest, you're seeing development happen nearly real time, as much as you would for any kernel organization. And then as you go up the stack, it starts to slow down and goes to more of a punctuated equilibrium sort of model. And what you're missing about that is that, you know, Android's community of developers is a mix of chipset manufacturers, handset manufacturers, carriers, Google, and app developers. So app developers are actually most often closed. But what you'll find is that chipset vendors are happy to see their code open source. They just don't want to show other chipset vendors that code until the product launches. The same is true of handset manufacturers. So you'll have handset manufacturers talking to multiple chipset vendors, but not letting the code from one chipset vendor go to another chipset vendor. And they're all talking to us, and they expect us to respect the boundaries between their companies. And so we end up having sort of a walled garden until we really reach a release point that we can share with the rest of the world. So it's complicated. And this is why we have tools like Gerrit, and we also develop a lot of Git as well, so that Android can continue to exist as a multi-home, multi-master project. So yeah, I mean, honestly, without Git, it would be very difficult for us to manage all the source code in the way that we manage it right now. So I think Android is up to something like 360 different repositories, comprising what you think of as Android. And that's wrestled into place using the Gerrit and repo tools. And those are fully open source, so tools as well. So yeah.
There is a history of bad relationship between the Linux community and Google.
Yeah, so if you look back about 5 years, when we first released Android, we did something called Wakelocks, which was basically a way for the kernel to be informed by the user space when it should go into a sleep mode or not. So mobile phones aggressively sleep. I mean, they're often sleeping when you don't even realize it. Sometimes they're even sleeping when the display is on while you're reading some web page or something like that. And so that level of aggressive sleeping simply wasn't supported in the kernel at the time. And you would sometimes see chipset features like that get surfaced, but it would rarely be surfaced at the user level. So what we were doing is we were doing something that most of the kernel community at the time was not thrilled with. And so people were like, oh, you're forking the Linux kernel. And we're like, sure, we are. You know, and I predicted at the time it would take about 2 years for us to come to terms and figure out what's the right thing for the Linux kernel, as well as what's the right thing for mobile and Android devices. It took a little bit longer, it took about 3 years, but now it's fine. Wakelocks were re-architected slightly into, I guess they're calling them spin locks or something now. And now it's just part of the mainstream. And that's really good because, with the number of Android devices being shipped, having the driver support being written in a way that's Android friendly means that it's also being written in a way that's Linux friendly, since the changes are all mainlined. I think that's really the crux of it. Every once in a while we do unusual things in the kernel, but it's nothing as dramatic as that was. And also, Android's done very well in the market, and so the kernel community has been incentivized to work with us, and that's been good for us too. And so we try to pay back not just by releasing source code, mind you. We also tried to come to the right kind of set of compromises that was good for mobile devices as well as for the Linux kernel. And so I think we met more than halfway. Each of us did. The Linux kernel changed a little bit in how it works, and we changed a bit of how we did it. But we did it in such a way that didn't sacrifice battery life, which was the driving concern for us from the very beginning. Battery life concerns in mobile are astonishing. And people talk about these new chips, but the batteries really haven't gotten all that bigger from an amperage perspective, a watt-hour perspective. So those changes to the Linux kernel make a huge difference for us in the mobile space.
I will go back to the development model of Android. Whenever I talk to the free software community, it's criticized for being an open source project which is developed in a closed manner. I was talking to Eric Raymond, and he said it's more or less like a gated community, though it's okay to have a gated community. Can you explain or elaborate a bit about why it's okay to have a gated community like Android?
I don't really care what people call it. When you look at a community of developers in an open source project, the question you want to ask yourself is who's writing the code and why. That will inform you as to who you should be catering to. So for instance, we get most of our code either written at Google or from chipset and handset manufacturers. We get very little code from carriers, and we get patches here and there from the outside world. Now, so we cater to those chipset and handset manufacturer communities, and we try to ensure that they are incentivized to continue to work with Android. So then the answer is, well, if you were more open to everybody, you would get more non-chipset and handset manufacturer patches, and that might be true. And there's a very exciting mod community of Android who, for instance, will port Android open source project back into older phones that the manufacturers are not interested in doing anymore, and the rest. But for the people who are enthusiasts, we've found that a lot of their creativity happens at the app level, and that's hardly been impacted by the model. So that's good. But there are going to be some people who want to ship, for instance, Android onto alternative platforms that it was not targeted to by a manufacturer. And they have a harder time of it because it can be very difficult to come across open source drivers for a non-Android platform device. So like if it's a QNX device or a Windows mobile device, manufacturers won't always provide drivers to you. And so we actually have ongoing discussions all the time on how to get those drivers open sourced into the mainstream kernel as it is. And this is a long, long discussion. So yeah, so it might be gated community. But what we tried to do is make sure the gated community was as large as possible so that we could keep the operating system moving forward. And I of course, think we've been successful with this, but it does feel exclusionary to say the modding community sometimes, and that's too bad.
When I talk to the free software community, I often hear that if Android was developed in an open manner, then the quality of contribution, the quality of code would have been much better than what it is now.
Well, I mean, so if you look at how people contribute to open source projects, that's a good question. I would think that we would get more drive-by patches, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean that in a good way. Small corrections for utility, bug fixes, that kind of thing. The kinds of patches that wouldn't increase. So what happens right now, so for instance, is we'll have a modding community find a bug, or they'll have some feature they don't want to implement, and they'll go and implement it, and it'll take some time. Then they'll try to submit it through the Android open source project, and the reality is inside the gateway, it's already been done, or it's been changed in such a way that that patch doesn't make any sense anymore. And that was very frustrating for early patchers. And so those sorts of patches didn't flow. I don't think that they would flow anyway in a wide open model, because people would say like, oh, that group's already doing that direction, and it would be incompatible, and they're more likely to talk to them than to us. So, yeah. So what's happened is over the years, people have done less and less of that kind of patching into the Android open source project, because we haven't been able to accept their patches. And so, I can't go back in time and say, Android's all open, give us your patches, and we can integrate it, because it didn't work that way. So it'll be interesting. I think that over time you'll see more and more patches from the outside community be acceptable, because as the operating system has matured, those sorts of big, broad API-changing patches are rarer nowadays. So yeah, so I think that'll get better over the years. But I would be hard pressed to tell you how many years. Probably 4, if I had to guess. But an area where I would love to see more community activity, as well as more discussions with manufacturers, is there's still a binary driver problem where people are creating user space binary drivers for Android devices, and there's not really a point to them. It's very hard for you to tell me that, for instance, a calibration routine for a compass or a 3D accelerometer is really all that important, that you need to keep it closed. I think you'll sell more chips, in fact, if you open source your accelerometer gyro code rather than less, and you could put it inside the kernel, and it would make it more likely people would pick your chips. So it's stuff like that I would like to see reduced. The exposure to binaries be reduced in that manner.
So are you working with companies on it?
Oh yeah, no, we try. We're not always successful, but I think that the more manufacturers who listen to these kinds of broadcasts, the better. So we'll see how it goes.
Google is a huge supporter of open source and open standard, but when we look at properties like Chrome or Android, ODF is not very well supported. If I get an email with an ODT document attached, I can't even open or view it on my Android device.
Yeah, so I'm actually hoping that we can incentivize the LibreOffice folks to bring us an Android version. I think that'll happen before other commercial providers or Google provides proper viewers for mobile. We've had real challenges just getting it working for docs and spreadsheets for earlier versions of ODF standard. And that's because we actually purchased that technology from an external vendor. So getting updated versions of that, I haven't had a lot of luck in pushing that agenda. And there's some chicken and egg going on where there's not enough people using ODF to drive the desire of the industry to produce ODF solutions.
I often hear this argument that there is no demand for ODF, that's why the support is bad. But at the same time, Google is pushing its WebM and WebP, whereas there is no demand for them either way. So why not ODF?
A lot of reasons, some of which I can share. ODF, it's just, unfortunately, the demand is very low. And we feel that the demand for free codecs is important in ways that we haven't seen ODF take off, in ways that would drive that sort of desire for free codecs.
If you look at this entire NSA spying scandal, how easy it is to insert backdoors in open source technologies, and is there any advantage of using open source technologies over closed source or proprietary technologies?
So I think you're no more worse off with open source, and in fact you're better off with open source derived projects than you are with pure commercial projects.
I think you mean closed source or proprietary, because open source can be commercial as well.
Yeah, I mean proprietary, like no code is available to you. So yeah, in those cases I'd say that you're probably better off with open source whenever you can, because at least you can look at the code and you can think that maybe other people did too. But honestly, I don't think that's how the NSA is breaking things. It's not because they have access to the code that you don't. It's because they've found vulnerabilities and they're exploiting them on the open wire, right? So if you read their presentations, what they're doing is they're taking a position in these data centers of the telecom providers. And I'll tell you, we do not have any NSA machines in our data centers. We do respond to national security letters, but we do that according to the law. It's complicated. So I've been of the opinion that there's no way that they could make this whole snooping thing work outside of the national security letters unless they had maybe found some vulnerabilities with the technology. And I guess the recent release was that they had found vulnerabilities in the technology, but I don't know. I'm having a hard time buying some of what they've been releasing. And not because I think that they're incompetent, but I do think that they're trying to take credit for technologies not in evidence. So, yes, I probably shouldn't say more, but I think there's something fishy going on in a lot of ways. But not at Google. We've been very strongly. You should read what Eric Gross recently wrote about this. I mean, he's like, listen, I mean, it's his job to know about these things, and he will not allow other machines in our data centers like that, and we never have.
Open source and patents don't go very well together. They're a body like OIN, but if you look at patent disputes with Oracle, they don't seem to be helping very much.
So it didn't help much in the Oracle case, but knowing where our software came from really helped in the Oracle case. So the point of OIN and our open patent pledge is for us to tell people that when they use our open source code, when they use our code or our platforms, that we're not going to act like Oracle did, right? So we try to enumerate our position, and the rest of the industry is going to be the rest of the industry. But we try to lead by example. The reality is we need software patents. We have software patents, and in a world where there's so much patent litigation, we have to have them. So what I can do is release software under patent granting open source licenses that protect us and protect our defensive posture. I can, and by I mean Google in this case, Google can put them into these pledge networks like OIN and our open patent pledge that we recently announced. Another 10 or 20 patents are being attached to that one. And those are ones where we actually enumerate which patents we're reserving for our friends in open source software. And we can just do the right thing, for us and our users. And that's satisfying intellectually, and I feel like we're not part of the problem. But the problem is a very big one. So we try to do other things, working with the patent office, trying to enhance prior art finding and that kind of thing. But this is not a discussion that's going to be over in weeks. It's going to take 5 to 20 years. And most people don't want to fight that long. But we're going to be around 20 years from now. So we're trying to fight the good fight now to have proper patent policies become the norm as opposed to being the exception. Or you just have Google and maybe Twitter and a couple others doing the right thing. So. And this is why we actually licensed Android largely under Apache. People never realize this, but we picked Apache not because it was permissive, although that was very appealing for people. We picked it because of the patent pledges attached to it. So, we knew what we were doing.
Microsoft used to hate patents because they were sued so many times, but now they seem to love it. It's kind of become their business model. So when we look at Google's patent pledges, it doesn't appear that Google is trying to fight to change the current patent system. Instead, it looks like Google is supporting the current patent system.
So the nice thing about our pledges and the way that we do it is that with the Apache release of software, that obligates us into the future. There's a lot of companies out there right now are saying, oh, no, we would never do patent lawsuits against people. Oh, no. And then they get into some trouble, and then they do it. And it's like, or you have Microsoft, who they then give their patents to another organization, and then that organization sues us. Or Intellectual Ventures, who does the same thing. So it's like, there's a lot of people talking, but when you see them releasing software under patent granting open source licenses, that's when they're making the right kind of promise. So all I'd say is that I think our patent pledges are solid, but I know that Apache means that I'm obligating the Google of 17 years from now, not just the Google of today. And that's very appealing for me as someone who loves software, and the ability to use it freely.
Are you lobbying to change the current patent system?
We are, but the thing about lobbying work, everyone's going to tell you, oh, no, we really want patent reform, But lobbying work is a multi-decade process, and we are working on trying to get great patent changes to happen, but it's a long slog.
Are you in favor of software and process patents?
Well, we have to be in favor with them because we have them for our defense. So we sort of don't have the option of saying we don't believe in software patents, because we obviously believe in them because we use them to protect ourselves. And by protect ourselves, I mean from offensive patent action, not as a preemptive strike or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, they're there for us to use as a weapon too. But yeah, as a technologist, I find some of these patents to be a bit broad, and maybe I wouldn't have awarded them, knowing what I know about technology. So, I think the right thing to do is, the people at the patent office actually aren't stupid. People like to go around saying, oh, patent officers are stupid and all such. I don't think that's smart. I don't think that's wise, and I don't think it's true. I think that if we can give them the tools they need to put the proper thoughtfulness into all of these patents in the proper time, and they're given that time, that I think we can see real change. And it's work to be done not just at the patent office, but in the legislative branch, as well as in the judiciary, and how the patents are treated at the Supreme Court level and all the rest in different districts. So this is a fight that happens across the country and through these treaties throughout the world. So fighting the good fight is something that sort of obligates all of us. So for instance, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is going to hit a lot of Asian Pacific countries. I hope you like software patents, because it's not super clear that you're going to be able to get out from under them either. And the reality is, since America is such a big market, and since Europe is such a big market, what happens in America and Europe really matter to the rest of the world, because if they want to actually ship product, if they want to work economically with these enormously huge markets, well, they're going to have to start paying attention too. So, yeah, it's an interesting world.